presentation. Our presenters will answer any questions at the end as time permits. Today we have with us Darcy Merritt and Jessica Black. Darcy Merritt, PhD, is an associate professor at New York University's Silver School of Social Work and a faculty fellow at the school's McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. She is also an associate editor for Children and Youth Services Review and has extensive experience as a child welfare practitioner and researcher. Her research interests include child maltreatment prevention, neighborhood structural impact on maltreatment, and experiences of those served by public child welfare systems. Jessica M. Black, PhD, is an educational neuroscientist and associate professor at the Boston College School of Social Work. She obtained her doctorate in educational psychology from Stanford University and completed a postdoctoral research fellowship in the Center for Interdisciplinary Brain Sciences Research within the Stanford University School of Medicine. She has been published in many leading neuroscience research journals and is the chair of the Children, Youth, and Families Department within the Boston College School of Social Work. Her areas of research focus on learning differences, school adjustment, and resilience. Darcy and Jessica, thank you for your patience today, and thank you for being with us and for your many contributions to the field of child abuse and neglect. Now I will turn it over to Darcy for the first part of the presentation. Okay, we can see your screen. Great.
Hi, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. I hope everybody can hear me well. So thank you for that introduction, Heather, and for having both Jessica and I participate in this really important webinar. I'm going to go ahead and set up the context foundation for what Jessica will go into in terms of brain functioning and developmental challenges in the context of trauma. So just as an outline, by way of outline, the way in which we're going to go forth with the webinar is that I'm going to talk about maltreatment and maltreated children and trauma, and then the impact of trauma on developing children. And then I'll turn it over to Jessica so that she can speak more in detail about brain development, those sensitive periods and plasticity of brains as people grow. She'll also talk about some neural development and traumatized children and share some information on some really key studies that might be of interest. All in the context of traumatized children. And then she'll turn it back over to me and I will make some recommendations for practitioner awareness and touch on some policy implications. And that will be followed by question and answers. So what we need to remember at all times is that maltreatment is traumatizing for all children. So children interfacing with the child welfare system by virtue of even being investigated for potential abuse are traumatized just by that, the fact that they're going to be intruded upon to make sure that they're cared for and their children are raising them according to our standards. And so regularly, whether children are maltreated or not, kids and adolescents are extremely susceptible to stress, and we need to consider that. We so often as social workers rely on this framework where we are required to assess a biopsychosocial, but we tend to ignore and not pay much attention to the bio part of that. We kind of go straight to the social. So I think that we need to make a concerted effort to move back and understand exactly how these contextual lived experiences are impacting development on children and their brains and their functioning as they grow. So children in the child welfare system, whether they have been indicated as maltreated or actually have substantiated cases of maltreatment allegations, they are all immediately traumatized. Children who are removed from their homes, every time they're removed, that's even more trauma. And every time they're placed back and moved again, the trauma continues, and we are complicit in just supporting a system based on our rules and regulations that continue to traumatize kids. But we need to do a better job at understanding exactly how they're being impacted negatively. So this trauma actually ends up being a function of a host of internalized functioning behaviors, most notably depression among adolescents. So in the United States, as of 2016, there were roughly 277,000 kids that were victims of maltreatment. In the United States, it's also to point out that roughly on any given day, between 75 and 80% of the children that interface with the Child Protective Services system are actually involved due to neglect. And we have various forms of neglect, and the definitions need to be fine-tuned. The most prevalent form of neglect is supervisory neglect. Most of my research posits that neglect is directly related to a dearth of financial resources, specifically poverty. Supervisory neglect basically means children don't have appropriate supervision. Children are lacking childcare. Maybe mom left the 2-year-old home with the 14-year-old because that was her only option. There's physical neglect, which is also considered a lack of resources such as proper clothing, sustenance, proper nutrition, proper shelter, and there are other forms of neglect. There's medical neglect, there's emotional neglect, and we do a pretty poor job at teasing out the correlates of each as separate experiences. But what we need to really remember is that not only is abuse, physical abuse, traumatic to children or anybody, but the impact of being neglected of needed resources is also very, very disturbing and leads to really poor outcomes later on across a lifetime. So it's not uncommon for child welfare involved kids to experience PTS, post-traumatic stress, and depression based on their prior experiences of child abuse and neglect. That happens a lot, but we rarely assess what that means in terms of behavioral outcomes down the line. Prior research that has used framework of developmental traumatology has suggested that the overwhelming stress of child welfare involvement coupled with maltreatment experiences may be associated with increased poor social outcomes in adulthood. There are so many different deleterious outcomes in adulthood directly related to the experiences of adverse childhood experiences and depression and trauma and maltreatment. So we would be remiss in not addressing this at the front end. So trauma is highly documented and prevalent among adolescents who are receiving these services, mostly because of them being in chaotic homes, children being forced to adhere to rules that aren't set forth by their parents, having different oversight over their families is traumatic, and it's just not suited for autonomy or self-determination and parental decision making, and it creates a little bit of anxiety in children that have to adhere to such experiences. So what we need to remember is that child abuse and neglect ultimately leads to strained brain development. There's no other way to look at it. Experiencing child abuse and neglect has a salient impact on their development. And as I mentioned briefly, which Jessica will talk about more in detail, these are stages when children's brains are extremely plastic and susceptible to stress. It doesn't mean that there's no hope. It means that we need to really pay attention to it. So scholars are increasingly studying this impact of child abuse and neglect on brain development, but I believe we can do better. So thinking about the developmental stages and trauma and the consequences, we have to consider challenging family systems and socio-ecologies. In addition to developmental growth, child-centered characteristics and life events, they're all highly associated with the maturing neurobiological systems. Pervasive trauma at crucial developmental stages, such as childhood and adolescence, is related to neurobiological setbacks, and they have long-term deleterious outcomes, such as chronic physical and psychological conditions in adulthood, the ability to function well as contributing citizens, academic deficiencies. There's a whole host of problems that can come about if we don't pay attention to particular trauma that happens at developmental stages and ways in which we can mitigate those impacts. That's what we need to be doing. So adolescence, childhood and adolescence is a stage of life when early onset exposure to stress generally results in poor developmental trajectories due to suboptimal effects on the frontal cortex of the brain. These experiences linger in a child's memory and manifest in internalized and or externalized reactions to the challenging situations perceived as a threat to their equilibrium. I'll mention here, we're talking about children and the impact of trauma on their brain development now, but I want to say that we still have to, in tandem, think about the parents that care for them and whatever past trauma they've experienced and how that is impacting their ability to parent their children and how that transfers down contextually. So trauma coupled with undesirable behaviors oftentimes results in adverse socio-behavioral outcomes such as delinquency, fewer social competencies, substance abuse, poor academic trajectories, aggressive behavior, and a host of mental health issues. I've done a number of studies looking at outcomes based on the trauma of having experienced child abuse, and it's pretty salient that they have poor chances of functioning well and developing positive peer networks, wherein their behaviors would be more positively displayed. There's a lot of substance abuse that happens, and that's a way of coping, I believe. A lot of delinquent peer engagement, fewer social competencies, and academic deficiencies, as I mentioned earlier. The short-term impact of such trauma, as I mentioned, depression, anxiety, withdrawal, unexplained physical symptoms, and both internalized and externalized behavioral problems and physical health issues. The research is kind of mixed with regard to gender differences, and what I've found is, for the most part, girl children tend to internalize their behaviors based on this trauma, and the studies that I've done have noted that boys display more externalized behaviors. But as I mentioned, it's mixed, and it needs to be teased out a little bit more. So it plays out differently according to one specific demographic. So trauma exacerbates long-term issues when it comes to depression and developmental delays and emotional difficulties. What's important to remember in terms of policy change is that this costs a lot of money, billions of dollars over the course of a lifetime, that when we don't pay attention to how the trauma of maltreatment is impacting well-being outcomes across one's lifetime. Suicidal behaviors, employment opportunities, these are also all long-term consequences that can come about as a result of trauma. So what's important to remember with regard to the adolescent stage is the timing and duration of the stress. It has a really salient impact on their outcomes, particularly for those kids in between 8 and 18, when the brain is especially sensitive to stress. I prefer to kind of group children from 0 to 3, or 3 to 6, or sometimes 0 to 6, but that 8 to 12 will look different than 12 to 18. So I think it's important for us to pay attention to how each of these developmental stages is impacted differently by the type of trauma that people are experiencing. There are chemical imbalances that occur in the brain, hormonal responses to stress, circumstantial uncertainties influence our behavioral choices at all stages, but it's important to remember that adolescents and those who are maltreated are at especially heightened risk for suboptimal behaviors. The brain is translating information based on these traumatic stressors, and this results in their behavioral responses that are specific to the structure, their neurobiological structure. Previous research on animals has indicated there's a clear behavioral reaction based on exposure to stress, particularly with maltreated adolescents who are vulnerable to negative behaviors due to complex lives and exposure to chronic abuse at these really sensitive stages of development. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica now, and she's going to go into more detail about exactly how the brain functions. I just wanted to point out that the brain functions differently in context of a lived experience of maltreatment than it would in the context of a lived experience that's not having to do with being maltreated or experiencing such trauma. Are you there, Jessica?
I am here. Yes, thank you. All right. So hopefully you all can see the full screen as well.
Yes,
so
looks good.
I am going to give some background on the brain, trying to cover the fetal development really through adolescence in a pretty condensed time. So at the end of this, I have a few links that will help you learn more about brain development as it pertains to each of these different stages. And of course, we're also available via email if your question is not answered during our Q&A period. Okay, so let's see here. We know when we're thinking about all of the different jobs of all of the different organs in our body, that the brain's job is to learn. I think that that inherently takes on a strengths perspective. Oftentimes people question why is it that they behave the way they do? Why do they ruminate? Why do they experience higher levels of stress than a peer, etc.? And the brain has been built through past experience. That's both based on what has impacted neural development generationally, but also what has happened in real time. The brain is constantly trying to adapt, and it has a much harder time trying to adapt to a future that it hasn't experienced than to a past. It is structured and restructured essentially based on those interactions with our environment. And certainly that's the built environment, but that's also, especially when we're thinking about young children, the relational environment as being most salient. So I think, you know, the very first thing to just keep in mind is the brain's job is to learn. It is not there to filter, this is good, this is bad, this will be adaptive long-term or maladaptive long-term, but instead, this is here present in front of me, and my brain is ready to respond to it. It operates under the use it or lose it principle. And essentially what this means is that the neural connections, and I'll show you an image of neural connections soon, the ones that remain are the ones that are used. And so we can think about this in terms of, for example, the strength between the fight or flight response, which is subcortical, it's deep in our brain in the limbic system, and what builds over time, which is the executive functioning, sort of the brakes of the brain, decision-making, rational thought. The more that the brain has practice with and essentially receives messages that fight or flight right now is the most adaptive place to be, it's important to realize that that therefore is reducing, at least in those moments, the strength of the connections that are usually built over time from the limbic system to executive function or central control. The limbic system, and in particular the amygdala, that fight or flight space, operates in a way akin to a seesaw. The greater the activation you see in that area, the lower, the sort of the less activation you see in the neocortex, in particular in the frontal lobes, that help us to determine, is this a 10 or is this maybe a 2 or a 3, and how should I be responding? Instead, everything seems to go to a 10. So when we say use it or lose it, really what that means is early in the life course, if the brain has a lot of practice saying fight or flight is the mode we need to be in, that's where we need to be, we're going to see a really strong amygdala activation. We're going to see a very large amygdala, meaning those neural connections become very strong. And that over time, when we're thinking about intervention, what really needs to build in is practice to connect that seesaw to the central executive, the brakes of the brain, to be able to really process and understand what's actually happening. Now, the ability to do that also increases over time. So when we think about sensitive periods, which is the point that I have next, we know that experience, whether it's in the built environment or relational, has a greater impact during these sensitive periods. And we think of these sensitive periods, usually it's debated whether it's the first 18 months of life or 0 to 3. When we think about early intervention, which works on a 0 to 3 model, a lot of scholars are more on the side of it's really should be considered a 0 to 3 time. Now, that doesn't mean that plasticity then is lost. It just means that, you know, you need less intervention for a shorter period of time to see a maximal impact on brain development during this 0 to 3 time. There's a second period of sensitive development that's also taking place in adolescence. For girls, this happens a little bit before boys, just because girls go through puberty usually a year and a half before boys do. And what this means is that once again, the brain is in a space where it's highly sensitive to its environment. And we want to be really thoughtful about what we mean by environment here, because as the adolescent brain grows and develops and becomes, although not identical to the adult brain, in some ways cognitively getting pretty close, the environment in that sensitive period in adolescence certainly is relational. It's certainly the built environment, but it's also the internal milieu. It's essentially, what are the thoughts that I have about myself and my circumstances, ways that I'm building my identity, or really thinking about what has happened to me in the past, what could happen to me in the future. At the age of 0 to 2, where children are learning to develop language and learning how to use it in a productive way, they certainly are retaining memories of maltreatment and stress. But it is in the adolescent period where we see this sensitivity to experience, where we're really thinking about adding in that additional verbal or cognitive or perhaps linguistic aspect to sort of the making of their own understanding of the stressful experiences that they have been affected by. So when we're really thinking then about the fact that the brain is incredibly sensitive to experience, and certainly 0 to 3, and then right before puberty, really through adolescence, the brain remains plastic throughout the life course, but it's believed that the majority of the structure and functional changes, if you're looking at a spectrum of large change versus relatively small or nuanced scale change, happens into our mid-20s and perhaps into our early 30s. So when we're then thinking about anything we can do to support child development as it applies to maltreatment, we're really thinking about the resting on neuroplasticity, that any therapeutic intervention, anytime you're looking for a positive or a sustained behavioral change, rests on the fact the brain can change. And yet so often we don't talk about the brain, as Darcy mentioned earlier. We think, psychologically or socially, when really the model, at least in our field of social work, is biopsychosocial. And so we really need to recognize that change is possible at a neurobiological level, and really any behavioral change you're trying to support is a brain-based one. So I mentioned earlier the limbic system. If you look at the image on the right, the one that is actually referred to as the triune brain, you'll see a reptilian, limbic system, and neocortex in there. The reptilian system is the part that developed first, evolutionarily speaking. It is really what keeps us alive and it allows us to be able to engage in other tasks where we're not bogged down by trying to maintain consciousness, where we're not necessarily thinking about our own breathing rate, heart rate, pupil dilation, etc. So that's really these automatic processes that are running in the background for us. It's important to recognize, though, that when we're thinking about trauma and the experience of maltreatment, that it doesn't just rest in one place in the brain, that it sits within the reptilian. This is sometimes referred to as the hindbrain. If you're thinking about increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, hypervigilance, a hard time being able to or sort of respond to or recognize physiological symptoms in the body, these really start at that hindbrain level. and is the oldest part of the brain. And when we think about fetal development in utero, it develops first. Next, what we have is the limbic system, and I mentioned that earlier when I talked about the amygdala and how this fight or flight response, and also is a space where memories tend to be marked, behaviors tend to be marked as either positive or negative. For some children, a hug and a smile is marked positively. That's safe. That connects me to a caregiver. That is the building of secure attachment, etc. But as we know in the case of maltreatment, that a smile, that a hug isn't necessarily always going to be marked as positive. In fact, it can be marked as dangerous. And so therefore, in the limbic area, we have memories. We have memories that haven't maybe necessarily been linked directly to language, that the language connection we actually have really takes place in the neocortex. The neocortex is actually the largest area of the human brain, takes up about 2/3 of our brain. And this is really where you build not only the capacity for language, for reasoning, for decision making, for really slowing down when needed, and over responsive amygdala activation. Okay. On the left-hand side, you just have a more detailed image of everything that tends to fit within the reptilian, what's in the limbic system, and then what's in the neocortex. And I'll go through a couple of those points down the road with a couple of other slides. So the corpus callosum is actually the bridge that connects the left and the right hemispheres. When a baby is born, and you can see this, it's really actually myelinated axons, this sort of thick area in between the left and right hemispheres, barely exists when a baby is born. In fact, this grows over time, this large bundle of neural fibers. The brain myelinates. What that means is that the axons that allow neurons to connect to one another, those specialized brain cells, myelinate. So essentially, much like an electrical wire once covered in some type of insulator that's going to help conduct the electrical signal, same is true for the axon. Originally very vulnerable, very sort of receptive and responsive to its environment, but over time, building myelination helps it to send signals a lot faster, and it also helps the brain to become more specialized. That means the brain's going to become more efficient, and it's going to say things like, all right, left frontal lobe, you are going to be primarily responsible for linguistic development and positive affect. It doesn't mean the rest of the brain isn't contributing as well. It just means that over time, much as we do in our own lives, start to recognize ways that we can specialize, the brain is doing the same thing. When we think about child maltreatment early in the life course, the brain has not yet specialized, nor does it have that protective corpus callosum where some material, some behaviors remain marked as either left or right hemisphere. In fact, what you have almost all the time is bilateral activation. So what that means is the brain, when it's not protected, gets a very good job and exposure to being online all the time, left and right in symmetry, which is wonderful and lovely when we're thinking about really positive experiences for the child. Tactile responses, being able to respond to language cues, etc. It's really like cross-training the brain. But when it comes to maltreatment, what that means is the brain doesn't have a space to protect itself. It's not yet specialized or compartmentalized enough to just keep memory in one area. In fact, it is incredibly vulnerable during this time. I wanted to show a video. This is through a website called Sentis, S-E-N-T-I-S, and there are a number of different videos that Sentis has. They're all between 2 and 6 minutes to help you understand how the brain actually works. So this is one video that I would like to show on how the brain works. I am going to bring it up right here. And starting here, again, it's only about 2 minutes.
The brain is the most fascinating part of the human body. Not much to look at. It resembles a spongy mass of tissue, feels like tofu, and weighs roughly 4 tubs of butter. Our brain is actually made up of mostly water and about 10% fats. While our brain only makes up approximately 2% of the entire body's weight, it uses a massive 20% of the body's energy. The brain's basic building blocks are known as neurons, and we have around 100 billion of these, each with between 1,000 to 10,000 connections to other neurons, creating neural pathways or roads within the brain. There are literally trillions of neural connections within the brain. Similar to a city's electrical power grid, information is passed along these roads through a series of chemical messages and electrical impulses. As all of this activity takes place, our brain generates between 10 to 25 watts of power, enough to power a light bulb. Over the course of one day, your brain generates more electrical impulses from firing neurons than all of the telephones in the world. So really, your brain isn't just a spongy mass of tissue. It's your most complex organ, a power station that connects your every thought, movement, and feeling. And it's firing right now.
So although I think there's a lot in that video, what I think a takeaway message is important when we're thinking about maltreatment is that the brain is 2 to 3% of our body weight, but it commands between 20 and 25% of the energy that the body needs. So when the brain is being deluged with a number of competing demands, needing to pay attention to what parents are doing, what's happening in a community, what's happening in school, just on a daily basis, even without the addition of maltreatment. It's a lot. Kids can come home from whatever they're doing and look like they ran a marathon. And part of that is because the brain requires so much energy. The second piece is when it comes to maltreatment and hypervigilance, that the brain is on even more, that those neurons, and I have an image here, communication between Boston and New York in terms of how the neurons communicate through an axon, that there are constantly messages being sent, and those messages are ones of stay alert, pay attention, sort of don't let your guard down. They are not the neurotransmitters sending through about reward, joy, calming the brain. They are instead telling the brain and the rest of the body to remain vigilant. If we think about how neural systems build, and again, these are a couple of more detailed images, when we say the brain is changed by maltreatment, we can talk both about the function of the brain and the structure of the brain, both of those being true. But the change really rests after a baby is born on synaptogenesis. And synaptogenesis is really just a fancy way of saying that it's how one neuron connects to another neuron. Can we grow new neurons? Yes. Do we lose neurons and neural connections? Yes. But the primary ways when we say the brain is shaped or changed by experience really means the number of connections that neurons have with one another. So whatever happens to us, new configurations of neurons can become activated. They can increase activation at the synapses, or that little space in between the end of one neuron and the beginning of another. And that's the primary way where the brain is growing and changing. So when we then think about stress, and I have a definition here of a challenge, change, or threat to internal balance and well-being that one encounters daily. And of course, there is individual level variation in response to stress. But essentially what the body is trying to do is to maintain homeostasis. So the more times the body is whacked out of balance, and there are positive stressors, you know, meeting somebody who eventually is going to be a friend, versus tolerable and toxic stressors, every single time the body is being whacked out of balance and trying to adapt to neutralize the distress to get back to homeostasis or back into balance, we're expending energy. We're expending energy both when we're thinking about the amount of glucose, but also we're expending energy in terms of the body and the brain needing to continue to try to get back into balance. And if we're looking at what happens to the actual body during this time, the endocrine system and stress response system does a lovely job short term in trying to help protect us from stressors, to allow us to release cortisol for short-term energy bursts to be able to respond to a stressor and then get back into balance. But the problem is when there is this long-term chronic activation of the hypothalamus, intuitary, pituitary, and adrenal cortex, where essentially you have this ongoing message of stress and strain, and the body is not able to really shut that off very well. Again, why do we have cortisol, or what's happening in the body? We need it for immediate energy, but the issue is long-term, it also inhibits inflammatory processes that actually can be protective for us, along with reducing immune system activation as well. You know, chronic activation of cortisol and glucocorticoids really results in reduced myelination of those axons. It can increase cell death. And really what you can see is the dendritic degeneration. Essentially picture a tree with a number of branches trying to reach out to the next tree, much like neurons do. And over time, those branches just start pulling away. It doesn't mean they're gone for good. It just means more practice and exposure to be able to bring those neurons back into connection. Long term, what you're also going to see is compromised hippocampi. Again, that's in the limbic system, really important for memory. The hippocampus is really akin to the function of a librarian. The librarian likely doesn't know all the information in the library, but really acts as a conduit to be able to go to access stored memories. And when the hippocampus is damaged, it is much harder for an individual to not only make new memories, but access what they know they have stored somewhere as well. I wanted to walk through a couple of examples, some of which you might have thought about when it comes to stress and brain development, beginning with pregnancy. This is an example of a study that has taken on an interdisciplinary nature. The background of this is that we know dendritic arborization, so essentially the neural connections that want to reach out to other neurons and increase in synaptogenesis, really accelerate in the third trimester. They really help to develop the neocortex in the brain. In fact, if you think about the 34th week of pregnancy, 40,000 new synapses are formed every second in the baby's brain. We also know, of course, that exposure to non-optimal maternal distress and nutrition can negatively impact that plasticity, neurogenesis, how well those dendrites are arborized, and it's really very vulnerable both to poor nutrition and also to stress. This particular paper actually, instead of looking at levels of only nutrition and how nutrition affected fetal development, and separately looking at how the non-optimal maternal stress based on survey is affecting fetal development, they actually looked at stress and nutrition synergistically in this study. And so I know there's a lot on the slide, but the summary point here is that stress actually alters nutrient metabolism. So whether you're looking at macronutrients or micronutrients, again, all incredibly important for fetal growth and development, that when the mom carrying baby is in a heightened stress state, the nutrients that she's taking in are not metabolized as efficiently as they could be if she were not in a stress state. It's also important to recognize that nutrient deficiency alters the stress response of mom, so that if you have increased deficiency, not enough macronutrients or micronutrients, then you are going to see an elevated stress response in the body compared to having enough macro and micronutrients. So again, this sort of synergistic back and forth affecting fetal development. We also know that heightened levels of stress can be a strong risk factor for preterm birth. And in this particular study, you can see the different sizes of the brain markedly different between 25 weeks and term, for example. Also really identifying that when babies are born early, that even if they're born between, let's say, 32 and 36 weeks, which is not considered to be a micropreemie, they still are significantly more likely to have lower achievement scores several years down the road compared to babies who were full term. So another issue when we're thinking about babies and parent stress or distress is diaper need. And so we know, if we're thinking in the US, that 1 in 3 families report experiencing diaper need. Disposable diapers cost $70 to $80 per month per baby. That does not, the diapers for preemies and for sort of the sensitive diapers and sensitive wipes cost a lot more. And these cannot be obtained with food stamps, although there is legislation in a few states trying to push so that it actually is something that can be obtained in that way. This particular study through pediatrics basically asked parents, and these were moms and grandmothers, about their diaper need and about hardship they were experiencing related to not having enough diapers. The study essentially suggests that a very tangible way of reducing parental stress, which is an incredibly critical factor in affecting child health and development, is to inquire about diaper need and refer families to local diaper distribution services. And once doing that, they saw a significant reduction in self-reported levels of stress for the caregivers themselves. On a final note, I just wanted to pay some attention to adolescence and mood disorders. Dr. Ian Gottlieb, if you haven't heard of his research, you might want to take a look at it. He has some pretty groundbreaking work suggesting, in fact, that even without symptoms of mood disorder in adolescence, if there is he looks at maternal history, but if there's a significant maternal history of depression or mood disorder, I should say, that daughters are significantly more likely themselves down the road to show symptoms of anxiety or a mood disorder and to be diagnosed. And so he has recognized that, in fact, it seems to be a confluence of factors that's not just a genetic risk for a mood disorder, but in fact, risk for an increased response to everyday stressors. And so what he does with participants is he'll put them in an MRI scanner. He will show them images that are, pretty stressful to look at, but at the same point will also show them their own brain's reactivity. He'll show the physiological responses the body's having and the amygdala activation, and then give them coping skills as they're watching their brain responding to images live time, essentially like neurofeedback, but in an MRI. And weeks afterwards, when the girls come back to the lab, you see a reduced activation in the stress response based on the coping skills that they learned as well. Finally, and sort of before moving on to some closing comments from Darcy, I did just want to mention that when we're thinking about stress, stress goes two ways. So there's an optimal level of stress, and again, this varies from person to person. We often think of excess stress as being too much. It's wearing and tearing on the body. That's absolutely true. But if you look at the left end, it's sort of the lower tan box there where it says deficiency, it's also important to recognize that the body does need stimulation. And so there have been some scans done to indicate that when children are actually in a bored state, that you see a very similar amygdala activation to being in a heightened stress state. So it's, again, not that we, want to completely reduce excess down to deficiency, but rather find the optimal space where, stress can reside so that the body is being pushed enough that it can learn, grow, and learn how to cope, but not so much that it's being weathered by its experiences. A lot of that comes through caregiver relationships. We are built to connect to our caregivers and to others as well. And we recognize that when it comes to secure attachment, what that seems to do is to actually optimize network integration, basically helping the autonomic arousal and building positive coping strategies, helping really to regulate systems early. They basically help to organize these patterns of stress reactivity and interpersonal behavior, as opposed to insecure attachments, which actually seem to be more a measure of arousal than really a form of coping, because the child has a hard time being able to go to the parent to have their stress responded to and help to cope. But that also the relationship itself is a source of stress. Final comments when we're really thinking about stress and what might it look like and that we haven't thought about yet. One area that's really important to consider is loneliness. This is the work of John Cacioppo, really analyzing a number of different studies and suggesting that we are social beings, and when we're on the social periphery, it's a dangerous place to be. That lonely people have higher elevated markers of stress, of cortisol and epinephrine, both in saliva and in urine, and they actually report being more stressed in situations that most people who aren't lonely a report is only moderately stressful. In fact, it seems like being lonely boosts the body's fight or flight response. We also know that the quality of sleep is not particularly good. And when they're scanned, what you actually see in an MRI scanner for those who report loneliness is less reward activation. When viewing pictures of, even positive images like smiling faces. So again, the importance of social connection and not being disconnected or on a social periphery are also particularly protective. As I mentioned, there is a slide here that can take you to a number of different websites to learn more about neural development. Some of this can be used with clients, certainly with organizational trainings, etc. And the final link there to PubMed will take you to peer-reviewed articles on brain biology and development. All right, so we can push this back over to Darcy.
Hello. Hi again. See if I can change my slide here. I don't know if, oh, there we are. Okay, so as a way to pull this all together, I want to point out how important it is for practitioners to be aware of everything that Jessica just described in terms of the development of the brain in particular contexts, traumatic contexts, different developmental stages. I hope the take-home message that we can pull from that is that, as she said, that our brains do remain plastic for a long period of time across a lifetime. So there is always hope to make a change and reverse course and try to mitigate the impact of those early stressors and brain development, particularly for those with moms who are stressed out and babies in utero. That seems the most problematic for me in terms of being preventive, and I prefer to take a preventive approach. So practitioners need to make sure that in context that families have tangible financial resources so that they can buy diapers, so that they have proper nutrition, and so that that process that Jessica just described doesn't necessarily have to take a negative impact. People need to have available and accessible resources and services and supports. This also stems right back to equitable opportunity in terms of education. This is a systemic problem that we have, and it's structured in our society, and we need to just try to dive in at different points of entry to make sure that everybody has the opportunity for optimal development. And accessible resources, equitable opportunity, supports for holistic family care, and comprehensive needs assessments in their context is really, really crucial. We just can't separate and silo our approach to dealing with the impact of child maltreatment. We have to consider it as a whole and look at all of the different pieces that make the puzzle. In terms of policy implications, this also needs to have a nuanced approach, because I've been traveling a lot in different regions, and what's salient to me is that the way in which our federal and state and local governments are structured in terms of policy development has a really huge role on how we can advocate for certain changes to policies that would ultimately relate to service delivery enhancements. So we need to consider ways in which this type of information can really impact policy in a manner that then guides the development of services and practitioner behaviors. So we need to consider all of these measures in that context as well. A lot of people aren't thinking about the impact of brain development and child maltreatment and trauma and how that directly relates to our child welfare policies and our child protective services. There's a disconnect there. So increased research is needed. Federal and foundation funding opportunities should be paid attention to that would focus on understanding these modifiable risk factors of child maltreatment with the specific intent to mitigate brain development. So if we can increase the quality of people's environments and contexts and giving them resources, then we can impact that brain development that was just so wonderfully laid out to us, and in terms of how people are able to function and move move forward in their developmental processes. I just think there's a natural link between child welfare and neuroscience research, and we would be remiss in not paying attention. So that is all. We thank you. And we're absolutely open to questions offline via email. If you so choose to ask us, we can be available. Heather?
Great. Thank you so much, Darcy and Jessica, for sharing this information with us today. I do have a few questions. Are you able to stay on for a few minutes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hold on one second. Okay, this first question is for Darcy. This is from Carolina. She says, the presentation began by talking about how the very interaction with child welfare services is traumatic for a child. And she's wondering, is it true that children who come in contact with services, is this the same for children who come in contact with services through child advocacy centers, or is it limited to those who perhaps go through the police or social services? Does it matter what the interaction, how it comes about?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I think
Okay,
so.
I think the trauma comes about by virtue of the nature of the interaction. So if a family and children are interacting with the child advocacy center and it's a positive thing and it's not stemming from some negative experience that's occurred, then that's not as detrimental as, say, somebody that's interfacing with police who are coming to investigate child maltreatment in the home, or a county child welfare worker coming out and investigating and looking through the refrigerator and asking a bunch of questions and intruding in the household. It's very different, I think.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. This is a question from Joanne, and again for Darcy. She's asking about your focus is on maltreatment, excuse me, but she's asking about child sexual abuse, where boundaries are also broken and silence is usually encouraged. Is the reaction of the brain the same in these situations? I guess for maybe both of you, actually.
Darcy, did you want to respond?
Go ahead, Jessica.
So part of the issue, and again, it does depend developmentally on when this is taking place, and whether there are any supports around at all. Is there any buffer for the child whatsoever, which will make a significant difference even in this case? So those are two questions to consider. But the piece of silence is one that is incredibly detrimental to the brain. We, as humans, need to process, to share, to experience, to be able to synthesize information because it's there anyway. So part of the silence, the ignoring, is reducing any sense of control or autonomy or predictability that the child has. And all three of those individually, but then taken together, significantly impact toxic stress.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is a question from Anthony, a little bit different aspect here. He says that he's always read that periods of greatest neuroplasticity are between 0 and 3, and again at the beginning of adolescence. And he's asking, what are the treatment or intervention implications of these two periods? And is intervention in early adolescence more effective than at other times during this heightened period of neuroplasticity?
So intervention is most effective when an event has taken place and needs to be responded to as immediately as possible. So if you know, things seem to be progressing and you know, pretty typical development without maltreatment in the first few years of life, and then some event or events were to take place early in adolescence, then then that would be the time, the optimal time for intervention. The sensitivity of the brain that's different between 0 and 3 and in adolescence is one of cognitive development and reward activation. So when children are young, between 0 and 3, the brain is just getting set up and it doesn't have a history. It's still trying to essentially learn all the bits and parts and who does what when. And we are very, very reliant on a stable brain around us to help us essentially integrate our own brain. As we get older and move into adolescence, the second period of sort of overproduction of connections and the pruning of the connections takes place in a very non-linear way. That first, what happens is there is a growth, a myelination, and an increased activity in reward circuitry in adolescence. It used to be believed that adolescents were sort of more at high risk spaces, making poorer judgments because of hormones and hormones alone. That has really been disregarded and is now better understood that in fact there is a disproportionate growth of activation in the reward circuitry, in wanting to do and engage in things that are rewarding, relative to the frontal, the prefrontal cortex and executive, that helps the brain to slow down and say, is this really something that I should be doing right now? Will there be short or long-term consequences? And so if you're thinking about intervention for adolescents, they're at a space where part of the part that's screaming most loudly in the brain is any part that wants reward, that's looking for an ability to be able to gain a positive sense of identity, of who they are, of how they can communicate. It also means that dopamine is on there, and dopamine really, although I think it gets connected to sort of the sense of happiness and joy, dopamine really actually allows for increased focus in the brain. So when we're thinking about that type of intervention in the case of maltreatment in adolescence, one question is, how long was the maltreatment ongoing? And then the second piece is to recognize that the brain is going to be very, very receptive at this and looking for, at this point, anything that can be seen as rewarding. And once you can sort of enter that reward circuitry, building a positive sense of self, connecting to strong developmental relationships, then what you also see, as I mentioned earlier, that seesaw effect where you're better able to jump into the cognitive reserves of the brain that are going to help build decision making.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question, just given that we're running a bit late. So this is, I don't know if you can speak to this, Darcy, I think this would be for you. Patricia is asking about the specific case of pregnant women and children under 6 leaving Central America because of extreme violence and migration, and migrating to the US. She's asking if there are specific kinds of interventions while on the move that you would recommend to minimize the impact of that kind of trauma and surviving that stress.
That's a tough one because that's the whole experience that you just described is a traumatic event and it's ongoing. And so those coping mechanisms are going to be needed, and they may serve as a buffer for some moms and kids on the move and for others not. Jessica could probably speak to the heightened stress of such movement, and it's crucial. I don't necessarily think that there's anything that can be done during that time. I think where the work would have to happen is after moms and children were settled and safe, and then there would have to be some supports put in place so that they could recover. But during that time, I think it's just fight and survive mode. Jessica, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that what the brain can do pretty well is respond to micro moments. So if there is any capacity or ability whatsoever during that migration to be able to take 30 seconds, a moment, so that the child and the mom can be reminded of the pairing that they have together, of the fact that they are a social relationship that has survived, that will remain. And again, this doesn't have to be hours and hours of discussion. Essentially, when the brain gets a little bit of a break, of a reminder of where we were, and kind of that none of that has changed. We're just in a temporary position right now. It doesn't mean that attachment is going to be forever disrupted. That can be really helpful both to mom and to the child. The other piece that I'll say, and especially in a state where it's really hard to know what is going to be the outcome, what does it sort of look like at the end of this journey, and when will it end? Any spaces where any predictability, any type of routine, anything that can essentially help to reduce the cortisol activation, because cortisol runs wild when there is very little sense of autonomy or personal control. If there are any ways that that mom and child can harness some sense of personal control that may be very specific to their family, their culture, their spiritual connections, a way in which it can be a grounding for them. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to be, and likely couldn't be, something when we're talking about we need, hours and hours and hours of this. Again, the brain does a nice job of being able to be reminded of something short term and then continuing to kind of come back to that when it's safe to do so.
Okay, great. Well, that's a nice, hopeful message to end on today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and again to Darcy and Jessica for being with us today. And as they mentioned, if you have questions, please send them to us at resources@ispcan.org, and we will make sure to get them to Darcy and Jessica and connect you. A recording of this webinar and a PDF version of the slides will be available on our website by tomorrow. We encourage you also to become a member of ISPCAN so that we can continue having informational webinars like these in the future. If you are interested in presenting or have ideas for topics for our webinar series, please contact us at resources@ispcan.org. Thank you all again for your time today and for your patience with the technical difficulties. We hope that you have a wonderful day or night, depending where you are. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.